The small town of Riverside sat quietly between the hills and forests like it had been there forever. People knew each other by name and everyone waved when they passed on the street. At the end of Maple Street lived an old man named Henry Collins who kept mostly to himself. He had moved to town about 15 years ago, and nobody really knew much about him except that he was polite and quiet. Henry spent his days working in his small garden where he grew tomatoes and beans. He would walk to the library twice a week and check out books about history and science. Sometimes he would sit in the park and feed the birds. The neighbors thought he was a nice man, but he never talked about where he came from or what he did before Riverside. When people asked, he would smile and change the subject so smoothly that they barely noticed he had not answered. Every year, the town held a Veterans Day ceremony in the square. The mayor would personally invite Henry because the old man looked like he was the right age to have served in the military decades ago. But Henry always said no thank you in the kindest way possible. He would tell the mayor that he preferred to honor the day quietly at home. After a few years, people stopped asking and figured maybe he had seen something bad during his service and wanted to forget about it. The children in the neighborhood were curious about the quiet man. He never got angry when their baseball landed in his yard. He would pick it up and throw it back with perfect accuracy every single time. The kids noticed he threw better than their parents and even better than their coaches. Some of them thought it was strange how straight his back was when he walked and how his eyes seemed to notice everything around him. But he was always nice, so they were not scared of him. On clear nights, Henry would sit on his front porch in an old wooden chair. He would look up at the stars for hours without moving much. His neighbors sometimes saw him out there and wondered what he was thinking about. The stars seemed to hold his attention in a way that nothing else did. He would sit there until late at night just watching the sky, like he was searching for something or maybe remembering something from long ago. The local shop owners knew Henry as a regular customer, who always paid exact change and said please and thank you. He bought simple food and never anything fancy. He drove an old truck that he kept clean and running well. His house was small but well maintained with fresh paint and a neat lawn. Everything about Henry Collins seemed ordinary and unremarkable. He was just another quiet old man living out his retirement in a peaceful town. But there were small things that did not quite fit if someone paid close attention. The way he would pause before entering a room and glance around first. How he always sat with his back to the wall in the diner. The fact that he never seemed surprised by anything. His hands were rough with old scars that looked like they came from more than just garden work. When he moved, there was an efficiency to it, like every motion had a purpose and nothing was wasted. The town doctor had tried to get Henry to come in for a checkup once. Henry had politely declined, saying he was feeling fine. When the doctor insisted because of his age, Henry finally agreed to one visit. The doctor was surprised to find that Henry was in remarkable shape for a man in his 70s. His heart was strong and his reflexes were unusually sharp. The doctor asked if he had been an athlete when he was younger. Henry just smiled and said he had stayed active over the years. Nobody in Riverside knew that Henry woke up every morning at 5 without an alarm. They did not know he did exercises in his backyard that would exhaust men half his age. They did not see how he would sometimes stand at his window in the dark, watching the street with an alertness that never quite went away, no matter how many peaceful years passed. Henry had built a quiet life in this small town, but parts of him were always somewhere else. The mayor tried one more time this year to get Henry to attend the Veterans Day ceremony. They were building a new memorial and wanted all the veterans there for the dedication. The mayor came to Henry's house personally and asked if he would reconsider. Henry listened politely as he always did. He thanked the mayor for thinking of him but said he still preferred to observe the day in his own way. The mayor left disappointed but not surprised. What the mayor did not know was that Henry would honor Veterans Day in his own manner. He would stand in his backyard at dawn and salute the rising sun. He would think about people whose names he could never speak and places he could never mention. He would remember things that happened so far away that most people did not even know those battles had been fought. Then he would go about his day like always, working in his garden and living his quiet life. The town prepared for the ceremony with flags and banners. Veterans from all the wars were invited and many were coming. Families planned to attend with their children to teach them about service and sacrifice. The high school band would play patriotic music. It was going to be the biggest ceremony Riverside had ever held. Everyone was excited except for the one man who had more reason to attend than anyone else knew. Henry watched the preparations from a distance. He saw them setting up chairs in the square and hanging decorations. He could have told them stories that would make their ceremony seem small in comparison. He could have explained what real sacrifice looked like. But he said nothing because that was what he had always done. Silence had kept him alive once, and now it kept his past buried where he thought it belonged. As the day of the ceremony approached, Henry went about his routine unchanged. Just another old man in a town that thought it knew him but did not know him at all. The day of the Veterans' Day ceremony arrived with clear blue skies and cool autumn air. The town square filled with people early in the morning. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a new memorial made of black granite. Veterans wore their old uniforms if they still fit, or their medals pinned to jackets if the uniforms did not. Families came dressed nicely and children held small flags in their hands. Among the crowd was a Navy SEAL named Jake Morrison, who was visiting his sister Karen. She had moved to Riverside 2 years earlier and opened a bakery on Main Street. Jake had taken leave and come to spend time with her and meet her friends. He wore his dress white uniform because Karen asked him to, and because he wanted to honor the local veterans. His chest had ribbons and medals from his years of service in some of the most dangerous places on Earth and beyond. Jake stood near the back of the seating area watching people arrive. He had the habits of someone trained to always know what was happening around him. His eyes moved across the crowd, noting exits and watching for anything unusual. It was automatic after so many years in special operations. He was not expecting trouble at a small-town ceremony, but his training never turned off completely. The mayor stepped up to the microphone and welcomed everyone. The high school band played the national anthem and everyone stood with hands over hearts. Then the mayor began calling veterans to come forward and be recognized. Old men and women walked slowly to the stage while people clapped. Some were from recent conflicts and some from wars so long ago that most of the younger people had only read about them in history books. Jake clapped along with everyone else, but his attention had drifted to the edge of the square. Behind an old oak tree standing well back from the crowd was an elderly man. He was not watching the ceremony like everyone else. Instead, his eyes moved in a pattern that Jake recognized immediately. The old man was scanning the area the same way Jake had been doing. He was watching the crowd and the surroundings with an awareness that seemed out of place for a town event. Something about how the man stood made Jake pause. His posture was too straight and too relaxed at the same time. His weight was balanced in a way that would let him move quickly in any direction. Jake had seen that stance before, but only in operators who had spent years in the field. This was not just an old veteran remembering his service. This was someone whose training had become so deep it was now just part of who he was. Jake started moving through the crowd toward the oak tree. He excused himself past families and groups of veterans, trying not to be rude, but wanting to reach the old man before he left. The ceremony continued with speeches about duty and honor, but Jake was no longer paying attention. His curiosity had taken over, and he needed to know who this person was. Before Jake got halfway there, the ceremony ended and people started standing and talking. The old man turned and began walking away toward the side streets. Jake picked up his pace, calling out, "Excuse me, sir," in a voice trained to carry across distances. The old man stopped and turned around slowly. His face was calm, but his gray eyes evaluated Jake in less than a second, taking in the uniform and the ribbons and probably a dozen other details. "Can I help you, Commander?" the old man asked in a voice that was steady and measured. Jake walked up and extended his hand. "Jake Morrison," he said. "I could not help but notice you standing back there. Are you a veteran, sir?" The old man shook his hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "I served, yes," he said, "but I prefer to keep a low profile. Enjoy your visit to our town, Commander." Jake wanted to ask more questions, but something in the old man's tone suggested this was not the time. Before he could say anything else, the man nodded politely and walked away. His stride was steady and efficient, covering ground faster than seemed possible for someone his age. Jake stood there watching him go and feeling absolutely certain that he had just met someone extraordinary. That evening, Jake had dinner at his sister's house. Karen made roast chicken, and they sat in her small dining room talking about the ceremony and the town. Jake mentioned the old man he had tried to talk to. Karen immediately knew who he meant. "Oh, that is Henry Collins," she said. "He has lived here for 15 years or so. Everyone likes him, but he is very private. We have all tried to get to know him better, but he is so polite about avoiding questions that you do not even realize he has not told you anything." Jake thought about this while he ate. His instincts were telling him there was a story behind Henry Collins. The way the man moved and observed things was not something you learned from ordinary military service. That kind of awareness came from years of operating in dangerous situations where one mistake could cost your life. Jake had worked with some of the best trained people in the world, and he recognized the signs. Did he ever mention which branch he served in? Jake asked. Karen shook her head. Nobody knows, she said. He does not talk about his past at all. Some people think maybe he saw combat and wants to forget about it. Others think he might have done something classified. But he is such a sweet old man that people respect his privacy and leave him alone. After dinner, Jake could not stop thinking about Henry Collins. He decided that tomorrow he would visit the old man's house. He told himself it was just friendly interest from one veteran to another. But really, he knew it was because something about Henry reminded him of legends he had heard whispered among special operations communities. Stories about people who had done impossible things in impossible places, and then disappeared into quiet lives afterward. Jake looked out the window at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in this small, peaceful town was a man with secrets. Jake was going to find out what they were. The next morning, Jake drove to the address Karen had given him for Henry Collins. The house sat at the end of Maple Street exactly as she had described it. Small and neat with white paint and dark shutters. The lawn was trimmed perfectly, and the garden along the side showed careful attention. Jake parked his car and walked up to the front door, feeling slightly foolish for making this visit, but unable to shake his curiosity. He knocked 3 times and waited. The door opened almost immediately, and Henry stood there in worn jeans and a flannel shirt. He did not look surprised to see Jake standing on his porch. "Would you like some coffee, Commander?" he asked, as if he had been expecting this visit. They sat on the back porch overlooking the garden Henry maintained. Henry poured coffee from a pot he had already made. For a while, they talked about simple things. The weather had been nice lately. Karen's bakery made excellent bread. The town was peaceful and friendly. But Jake noticed how Henry guided every conversation away from anything personal. Every question about his past was met with a gentle redirect so smooth that it almost seemed natural. "Sir, I hope this does not sound strange," Jake finally said. "But I have worked with some of the most highly trained people in the world. The way you move and the way you observe everything around you tells me something. Who did you serve with?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. His eyes looked past the garden to something far away that only he could see. "That was a very long time ago, son," he said. "Different world and different wars." "Were you special forces?" Jake pressed as gently as he could. "Something like that," Henry admitted. "But those days are behind me now. I am just an old man enjoying his retirement in a quiet town." Jake sensed he would not get more than that, so he changed the subject. They talked about Jake's own service and some of the places he had been deployed. Henry listened with real interest and asked good questions, but he never offered anything about his own experiences in return. After an hour, Jake stood to leave. As he walked to his car, he turned back with one more question. "Sir, did you ever serve off-world?" he asked. Henry's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Off-world, Commander," he repeated. "The Outer Colonies War," Jake said. "The Centauri campaign. I know it was 40 years ago, but the records say some Earth units fought there." "You should let the past stay buried," Henry said quietly. "Enjoy your leave, Commander, and thank you for your service." Jake drove back to his sister's house, but his mind was racing. The Outer Colonies War had ended before he was born, but every military member learned about it. Humanity's first real interstellar conflict against the hostile Kraith Empire, 7 years of brutal fighting across 3 star systems before a peace treaty, finally ended it. Millions had died on both sides, and the stories from that war were the stuff of legend. Back at Karen's house, Jake opened his encrypted military laptop. He had access to databases that most people never knew existed. He searched for Henry James Collins and found a basic service record. Marine Corps from 2042 to 2068 with an honorable discharge. But the details were sparse. No unit assignments listed, no deployments shown, no commendations or medals recorded. It was like someone had deliberately stripped the file of any useful information. Using his higher clearance, Jake dug deeper into classified archives. He found references to something called the Ghost Protocol. Most of the documents about it were heavily redacted. The few fragments he could read mentioned deep reconnaissance and priority black operations during the Centauri campaign. Whatever the Ghost Protocol had been, it was buried under layers of classification that even his SEAL clearance could barely touch. One document caught Jake's attention. A casualty report from 2065 listed an entire platoon as killed in action during the Battle of Centauri Prime. That battle had been the turning point of the war. But there was a strange notation on the report that said final verification pending and Ghost Protocol assets unaccounted for. Jake cross-referenced dates and found something interesting. Henry's record showed a promotion to Master Sergeant in 2065. The same year as that battle. The same year that mysterious notation appeared. But there were no details about what he had done to earn the promotion. Just a blank space where the citation should have been. Frustrated by all the redactions, Jake made a decision. He called an old friend named Pete Griffin who worked in naval intelligence. They had served together years ago and Pete owed him a favor. The phone rang 3 times before Pete answered. "Jake, what's up?" Pete said cheerfully. "I need a favor," Jake said. "It is about the Outer Colonies War, specifically anything related to the Ghost Protocol." There was a long silence on the other end. "Jake, that is buried deep," Pete finally said. "Like congressional oversight deep? Why are you asking about it?" "I met someone," Jake said. "I think he might have been part of it." Another pause. "Give me 24 hours, Pete said. "And Jake, this conversation never happened. I will call you back." Jake spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, but his mind kept returning to Henry Collins. What had that quiet old man done during the war? Why was his record so heavily classified? And why did he live in such isolation now, when he could probably have any position or honor he wanted? The questions piled up with no answers. That evening, Jake sat on Karen's porch watching the sunset. His sister came out and sat next to him with 2 beers. "You have been distracted all day," she said. "This is about Henry, is it not?" Jake nodded. "I think he is someone important," he said. "Someone who did something significant during the Outer Colonies War, but I cannot figure out what." "Maybe he does not want you to figure it out," Karen suggested. "Maybe he chose this quiet life on purpose and you should respect that." She was probably right, Jake thought. But he could not let it go. Not yet. Somewhere in the classified files and redacted documents was a story that needed to be told. A story about a man who had become a ghost. Pete called back exactly 24 hours later, just as Jake was finishing breakfast. The tone in his friend's voice was different from their last conversation. Tighter and more serious. "Jake, who exactly did you meet?" Pete asked without any greeting. "A man named Henry Collins," Jake said. "Lives in Riverside." "Why are you asking like that?" "Because the only Henry Collins I can find with the right age and service dates has a file that required me to get approval from a 2-star admiral just to look at," Pete said. "I could not access most of it, but what I saw," Jake paused and took a breath. "If this is the same guy, you need to understand something. He is not just a veteran. He is a ghost in every sense of the word." "What does that mean?" Jake asked, even though part of him already knew the answer would be disturbing. "The Ghost Protocol was a deep black program," Pete explained. "These operators were inserted behind enemy lines for months or sometimes years at a time. No support and no guaranteed extraction. Often they were presumed dead even by our own command. They gathered intelligence and sabotaged enemy operations and did things that never made it into any official record." Pete's voice dropped even lower. "There was one operator they called Phantom," Pete continued. "No real name in the files I could see. Just the code name. The legend says he spent 3 years alone on Centauri Prime, living among the Kraith and feeding us intelligence that helped win the war. When our forces finally took the planet, they found evidence of sabotage operations that had crippled the enemy's command structure from within." Jake felt cold despite the warm morning. "And you think Henry Collins," he started to say. "I cannot confirm it," Pete interrupted, "but the dates match perfectly. And there is a notation in his file that says codename classified and Ghost Protocol and highest honors recommended but declined. Jake, if your Henry Collins is Phantom, then he is probably the most decorated soldier that nobody has ever heard of." After hanging up, Jake sat in silence staring at his coffee. The quiet old man who grew tomatoes and read library books had possibly spent 3 years alone on an alien world, waging a one-man war against an empire, living every day knowing he might never see home again. And he had done it so well that the enemy never caught him, and humanity won the war partly because of what he accomplished. No wonder Henry wore no medals and avoided ceremonies. What medal could possibly represent 3 years of that kind of sacrifice? What ceremony could honor someone whose greatest achievements had to remain secret forever? Jake understood now why Henry had built such a quiet, anonymous life. After being Phantom for so long, maybe Henry Collins was the only identity he had left that felt real. Jake knew he should probably leave it alone like Karen had suggested. But something felt wrong about Henry living in isolation with nobody knowing what he had done, not for glory or recognition, but just so that someone would know, so that his sacrifice would not be completely erased from history. 2 days later, everything changed in a way Jake never expected. He was having breakfast when his secure phone buzzed with an emergency alert. He read the message twice because he could not believe what he was seeing. A Kraith diplomatic vessel had arrived in Earth orbit. It was the first official contact since the peace treaty 40 years ago. But intelligence suggested this was not a friendly visit. Intercepted communications indicated the Kraith were demanding the extradition of war criminals. Specifically, they mentioned human operatives who had conducted operations on Centauri Prime during the war. Jake immediately thought of Henry. If the Kraith had somehow discovered the identity of Phantom after all these years, they would want revenge. The peace treaty included provisions for mutual prosecution of war crimes, even though those provisions had rarely been invoked by either side. But the Kraith had long memories, and some of them had never accepted the peace. Jake drove straight to Henry's house, going faster than he should on the quiet streets. He found the old man on his porch drinking coffee as calmly as if nothing was wrong. But Jake noticed the subtle signs now that he knew what to look for. A packed bag sat by the door. Henry's eyes constantly scanned the surroundings with an alertness that was fully engaged. "You know," Jake said without any greeting. Henry nodded. "I have known for 2 days," he said. "Old habits die hard. I still have friends in certain circles who keep me informed about things like this." "They are coming for you," Jake said. Perhaps Henry agreed. The Kraith have long memories, and some of them never accepted the peace. "I did what I had to do during the war, Commander. I will not apologize for it, and I will not run from the consequences." Jake sat down hard on the porch steps. "Sir, with all due respect, that is insane," he said. "You saved countless human lives. You helped end the war. You cannot just let them take you." "I am an old man," Jake Henry said, using his first name for the first time. "If my being held accountable prevents another war and keeps the peace my generation bled for, then so be it." "That is not how this works," Jake argued. "The treaty protections go both ways. You were a lawful combatant conducting authorized military operations. You have every right to legal protection." Henry smiled sadly. "You are a good man, Commander," he said, "but you do not understand the politics involved. Earth's government will not risk interstellar conflict over one old veteran they have tried very hard to forget exists." Jake stood up, feeling anger rise in his chest. "We will see about that," he said. "You stood alone for 3 years, sir. You do not have to stand alone now." Henry looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "What are you planning to do?" he asked quietly. "I am going to make some calls," Jake said. "And then we are going to remind people what you did and why it matters. They want to erase you from history, but I am not going to let that happen." Henry opened his mouth to protest, but Jake was already walking to his car. He had already decided what needed to be done. Henry had sacrificed everything for humanity, and now humanity was going to stand up for him whether the politicians liked it or not. Jake Morrison had faced impossible situations before, but this felt different. He was not going to let a hero be sacrificed for political convenience. That evening, he made several encrypted calls to former teammates. Men and women he had served with who had retired, but maintained their skills and their loyalty to each other. The first call was to Frank Murphy. Frank had 30 years in special operations and now ran a security consulting business. When Jake explained the situation, Frank did not hesitate. "I will be there tomorrow," he said. "What do you need?" "Security and presence," Jake said. "And I need you to spread the word to anyone you trust." The second call was to Lisa Chen. She had been an intelligence analyst before retiring to teach at a university. Lisa was brilliant at finding information, and even better at knowing how to use it. When Jake told her about Henry and the Ghost Protocol, she was quiet for a long moment. "I can compile and declassify some information," she said, "enough to tell his story without compromising current operations. Give me 12 hours. Jake made 3 more calls that night. Danny Martinez, who had been a communications specialist, Carl Bennett, who was a medic, and Greg Palmer, who had skills in logistics and coordination. By morning, all of them were on their way to Riverside. They did not ask for explanations beyond what Jake had told them. A veteran needed help, and that was enough. The team gathered at Karen's bakery, which she closed for a private event. She brought coffee and pastries while Jake briefed everyone on the situation. The Kraith were demanding Henry's extradition. Earth's government seemed willing to consider it to avoid conflict. And they had maybe 72 hours before official proceedings began. "Gentlemen," and Lisa Jake said, "we are here to protect a veteran who deserves better than what he is getting." Henry Collins spent 3 years behind enemy lines during the Outer Colonies War. Now the Craith want him, and our own government seems willing to let it happen. Frank spoke up first. "What is the play, Commander?" he asked. "We make noise," Jake said. "Lots of it. We get Henry's story out there and make him too public to quietly hand over. And we provide security until the legal situation is resolved properly." Lisa already had her laptop open. "I have accessed what I can legally declassify about the Ghost Protocol," she said. "It is not everything, but it is enough to show what these operators did and why they mattered. I can start releasing it to veterans advocacy groups within the hour." Danny set up secure communications and began contacting journalists who specialized in military stories. Greg started coordinating with local veteran organizations. The operation was moving forward with the precision of people who knew how to work together under pressure. Meanwhile, Jake returned to Henry's house with Frank and Carl. Henry opened the door and looked at the 3 men in their civilian clothes but military bearing. "I appreciate what you are trying to do," he said, "but you are putting yourselves at risk for no reason." "With respect, sir, that is our decision to make," Jake replied. "You stood alone for 3 years. You do not have to stand alone now." Over the next 48 hours, something remarkable started to happen. Lisa released carefully chosen information about the Ghost Protocol to veterans advocacy groups. She did not mention Henry by name, but she told the story of Phantom, a single operator who had lived behind enemy lines for 3 years, gathering intelligence and conducting sabotage operations that helped humanity win the war. The story spread faster than any of them expected. Veterans organizations picked it up and demanded more information. News outlets started running stories about the mysterious Phantom and the Ghost Protocol. Social media exploded with people asking why they had never heard about this before. The hashtag #SavePhantom started trending, even though most people did not know who Phantom actually was. Then someone made the connection. A retired Marine who had served during the Outer Colonies War recognized details in the story. He posted online that he remembered rumors about an operator on Centauri Prime. Other veterans started commenting with their own memories and fragments of stories they had heard. The pieces came together quickly. By the second day, journalists had identified Henry Collins as the likely candidate for Phantom. They showed up in Riverside asking questions. The mayor held an impromptu press conference saying the town supported Henry and would not let him be taken without a fight. Veterans from across the region started arriving. Many wore their old uniforms or parts of them. They formed a protective presence around Henry's house. Karen's Bakery became an unofficial command center. Townspeople brought food and supplies. High school students volunteered to help with coordination. The story had captured people's imagination in a way that surprised everyone. Here was a real hero who had never sought recognition, a man who had done impossible things and then lived quietly among them for years. Henry tried to tell people they should not get involved, but nobody listened. Frank posted himself at Henry's front door. Carl made sure Henry was taking care of himself during the stress. Danny kept information flowing to the media. Lisa continued releasing declassified material that built the case for Henry's protection. On the 3rd day, the Craith delegation demanded a formal meeting with Earth's Defense Council. They wanted Henry extradited immediately to face charges of terrorism and war crimes, but public pressure had forced the government's hand. They could not quietly sacrifice a war hero when millions of people were watching and demanding answers. A hearing was scheduled at the Global Defense Headquarters. It would be broadcast worldwide. Earth's government would have to make a decision in public with everyone watching. Jake knew this was their best chance. Public opinion was strongly in Henry's favor, but the law was complicated and the politics were dangerous. The night before the hearing, Jake sat with Henry on his porch. The old man looked tired but calm. "I never wanted this kind of attention," he said quietly. "I just wanted to live out my years in peace." "I know," Jake said. "But sometimes peace requires standing up and being seen. You earned the right to live quietly. Now let us help you keep that right." Henry nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, "for caring about an old man you barely know." "You are not just an old man," Jake replied. "You are a reminder of what service really means, and that matters more than you realize." The Global Defense Headquarters building stood tall in the center of the capital city. Its walls were made of reinforced concrete and dark glass that reflected the morning sun. Security was heavy with armed guards at every entrance, and military vehicles positioned around the perimeter. This was where humanity's unified military command made decisions that affected billions of people across multiple worlds. Henry Collins arrived in a simple dark suit with no medals or ribbons. He had refused to wear his uniform, saying that part of his life was over. Jake Morrison walked beside him in his dress whites, looking sharp and professional. Behind them came military lawyers provided by veterans advocacy groups who had rallied to Henry's defense. The legal team had worked around the clock preparing their case. The hearing room was massive, with high ceilings and rows of seats for observers. Cameras were positioned to broadcast everything that happened. The tribunal consisted of 5 judges representing Earth's unified military command. They sat behind a raised bench looking stern and official. On one side of the room was the defense table where Henry would sit. On the other side was a table for the Craith delegation. The Craith representatives entered and the room went silent. They were tall beings with scaled skin that shifted between green and blue depending on the light. Their eyes were large and dark without visible pupils. The lead representative was named Throck, and he wore what appeared to be formal diplomatic robes. 2 others flanked him, looking equally imposing. Everyone stood as the judges entered. The chief judge was Admiral Patricia Brooks, who had served during the tail end of the Outer Colonies War. She had a reputation for being fair, but tough. She called the hearing to order and explained the format. The Craith would present their case first, followed by the defense. Then the tribunal would deliberate and render a decision. Throck stood and began speaking in accented but clear English. The human known as Phantom committed acts of terrorism on Centauri Prime, he said. He sabotaged civilian infrastructure and assassinated political leaders and caused widespread fear among our population. These actions violated the laws of war, and the peace treaty requires you to surrender him for justice. The Craith presented evidence of destroyed facilities and dead officials. They showed surveillance footage from Centauri Prime, though much of it was grainy and unclear. They argued that Phantom had operated outside the bounds of lawful combat and had targeted civilians intentionally. When they finished, Henry's lead lawyer stood up. Her name was Colonel Ruth Harper, and she had decades of experience in military law. She began by establishing the context of the war. The Craith Empire had invaded human colonies without provocation. They had killed millions of civilians and occupied 3 star systems. Earth had been fighting for survival, not conquest. Colonel Harper then presented declassified documents about the Ghost Protocol. She explained that operators were sent behind enemy lines to gather intelligence and disrupt enemy operations. Everything they did was authorized by proper military command and fell within the recognized laws of war. She showed that every target Phantom hit was either military infrastructure or command and control facilities. The surveillance footage the Craith showed was examined frame by frame. Colonel Harper demonstrated that the destroyed facilities were communications hubs and weapons depots, not civilian targets. The officials who died were military commanders, not political leaders. Every action Phantom took was a legitimate military operation against an enemy during wartime. Then she called Jake Morrison to testify. Jake explained how he had met Henry and what had led him to investigate. He described the Ghost Protocol operators as some of the bravest people he had ever learned about. Men and women who went into impossible situations with no support and no guarantee they would ever come home. The tribunal asked Henry if he wanted to speak. He stood slowly and approached the microphone. For a moment he just looked at the judges and then at the Craith delegation. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "I did what I was ordered to do," he said. "I volunteered for the Ghost Protocol knowing I might never return. I spent 3 years on Centauri Prime gathering intelligence that saved human lives. Every target I hit was chosen to minimize casualties while maximizing impact on the enemy's ability to make war. I followed the rules of engagement I was given, and I operated under proper military authority." Henry paused and looked directly at Throck. "I know you see me as a terrorist," he continued, "but I was a soldier doing my duty during a war your empire started. I am not proud of the things I had to do, but I am not ashamed either. If you want to call that terrorism, then we have very different definitions of the word." The room was silent when Henry finished. He walked back to his seat and sat down calmly. Jake could see the impact Henry's words had made. This was not a man making excuses or hiding from responsibility. This was someone who had done hard things and could live with the consequences. Admiral Brooks called for a recess so the tribunal could review all the evidence. The break lasted 2 hours. People in the observation seats talked quietly among themselves. Jake stayed close to Henry, making sure he was all right. The old man seemed tired but composed. When the tribunal returned, everyone stood. Admiral Brooks looked at Henry with an expression that was hard to read. She began by summarizing the evidence presented by both sides. Then she addressed the core question of whether Henry's actions constituted war crimes or legitimate military operations. This tribunal finds that Master Sergeant Henry Collins acted within the bounds of lawful military conduct. During a time of declared war, Admiral Brooks said, his actions were authorized by proper military authority and targeted legitimate military objectives. The Ghost Protocol, while highly classified, operated under the same legal framework as all military special operations. The extradition request is denied. The room erupted in applause from the observers. Jake felt relief wash over him, but Throck stood up angrily and began to protest. Before he could speak, another Kraith stepped forward. This one was older and wore different insignia suggesting higher rank. I am Commander Velk, the older Kraith said. I fought on Centauri Prime during the war. We knew there was a phantom among us striking without warning. We feared him, yes, but I must speak truth here. The phantom did not harm civilians. He did not attack hospitals or schools. He fought as a warrior fights with honor even when hidden in shadows. Throck turned to argue with Velk, but the older Kraith continued. This vendetta serves no purpose, he said. The war is over. We have peace. Pursuing one soldier for doing his duty during that war dishonors both our peoples. The room went completely silent. Everyone watched as the two Kraith faced each other. Finally, Throck spoke. Very well, he said. We accept this tribunal's judgment, but know this phantom. You are remembered on my world and will be for generations. Henry stood and looked at both Kraith. As your warriors are remembered on mine, Commander, he said. May our peoples never need to test each other again. After the hearing ended, people surrounded Henry, wanting to shake his hand and thank him. Jake stayed close, making sure the old man was not overwhelmed by all the attention. Reporters shouted questions, but security kept them at a distance. The legal team celebrated quietly, knowing they had won something important, not just for Henry, but for all veterans who had served in classified roles. Jake found Henry standing outside the building looking up at the sky. The Kraith vessel was visible as a distant point of light in the afternoon sky. The old man seemed lost in thought, watching that ship the same way he used to watch the stars from his porch. So what now? Jake asked, standing beside him. Henry smiled slightly. I go home, he said. Back to Riverside and my garden and my quiet life. Maybe this time people will understand why I prefer it that way. Will you wear your medals now? Jake asked. You earned them, sir. The whole world knows what you did. Henry considered this for a moment. No, he said. But perhaps I will wear something else. He pulled a small pin from his pocket. It was the insignia of the Ghost Protocol, a simple black star on a gray background. Just so the others know they are not forgotten, he explained. The others, Jake asked. The other Ghost Protocol operators, Henry said quietly. Some came home and some did not. I want them to know that their service mattered even if it had to stay secret. This pin will remind people that there were more of us and we all did our part. They flew back to Riverside that evening. Karen picked them up at the small regional airport. The town had organized a welcome home gathering, but Henry asked them to keep it small. He was tired and wanted to rest, but he agreed to attend because he understood that people needed this. The gathering was held in the town square where the Veterans Day ceremony had been just weeks earlier. This time Henry stood in the center of it all, surrounded by people who finally knew his story. The mayor gave a short speech about courage and sacrifice. Veterans who had traveled from across the region to support Henry during the crisis stayed to honor him properly. Henry spoke briefly, thanking everyone for their support. He talked about service and duty in simple terms that everyone could understand. He said that every person who serves does so believing in something bigger than themselves. Some wear medals and some do not. Some have public stories and some must remain secret, but they all serve the same cause. When he finished speaking, people applauded, but it was different from the applause at the hearing. This was quieter and more personal. These were neighbors and friends who had lived near Henry for 15 years without knowing what he had done. Now they understood why he was the way he was, why he valued peace and quiet, why he watched the stars. Over the following weeks, life in Riverside slowly returned to normal. The reporters left and the extra security was no longer needed. Henry went back to his routines of gardening and reading and walking. But things were different now in small ways. People greeted him with more respect. Children asked him questions about the war, and he answered them carefully, focusing on lessons about courage and doing the right thing rather than glorifying combat. Jake stayed in town longer than he had planned. He helped Henry deal with the aftermath of suddenly being famous. Interview requests came in daily, and Henry declined almost all of them. A few he accepted when Jake convinced him that his story could help other veterans feel less alone. One afternoon, Jake and Henry sat on the porch like they had that first morning weeks ago. They drank coffee and watched the garden grow. The packed bag that had sat by Henry's door during the crisis was gone now. The old man seemed more relaxed than Jake had seen him. "Thank you," Henry said, "for not letting me face that alone." "You would have done the same," Jake replied. Henry nodded. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I would have. That is what we do for each other." Jake had to return to duty soon. His leave was ending and he had responsibilities. But he promised to visit again. He also promised to stay in touch with the other Ghost Protocol operators they had located during the research. Many of them had lived quiet, anonymous lives like Henry. Now they were connecting with each other for the first time in decades. Frank and Lisa and the others who had come to help also prepared to leave. They gathered one last time at Karen's bakery. She made a special cake and they shared stories late into the night. Henry joined them, and for once he talked about old times. Not about the war itself, but about the people he had served with, their names and their courage and what they had meant to him. The night before Jake left, he walked through Riverside one last time. The town was peaceful under a clear sky filled with stars. He thought about how close they had come to losing Henry to politics and old grudges. But people had stood up when it mattered. Veterans and civilians alike had said, "This is not right, and we will not allow it." Jake realized that was the real story here. Not just what Henry had done 40 years ago on a distant world, but what ordinary people had done in the past few weeks. They had fought for someone who could not fight for himself. They had demanded that service and sacrifice be honored, not discarded when it became inconvenient. 3 months passed, and life in Riverside settled into a new rhythm. Henry Collins was still the quiet man who tended his garden and read at the library. But now people understood who he really was. Children asked him about space and courage. Veterans sought his advice. He handled it all with the same humble grace he had shown for years. The next Veterans Day approached, and this time Henry agreed to attend the ceremony. He told the mayor he would even say a few words if they wanted. The whole town buzzed with anticipation. This would be the first time Henry publicly acknowledged his service in front of his neighbors. The day arrived clear and cool, just like the previous year. The town square filled with even more people than before. News crews came from the capital to cover the event. But the mayor had asked them to be respectful and keep their distance. This was for the town and its veterans, not for ratings. Henry wore a simple dark suit with only one small pin on his lapel, the Ghost Protocol insignia, that black star on gray background. Several other elderly veterans in the crowd wore the same pin. They had come from across the country to stand with their brother. Ghost Protocol operators who had spent decades in silence, now visible for the first time. The ceremony proceeded with the usual speeches and music. Veterans were called forward and recognized. Then the mayor introduced Henry Collins. The crowd stood and applauded as the old man walked slowly to the microphone. He stood there for a moment looking at all the faces. Some he had known for 15 years. Others he was meeting for the first time. "I am not good at speeches," he began. His voice was quiet but clear. "I spent most of my service in silence. But I want to say this. Every person who serves does so believing in something bigger than themselves. Some of us wear medals and some do not. Some of our stories are public and some must remain secret. But we all serve the same cause, which is protecting the people we love and the future we hope to build." He paused and looked at the other Ghost Protocol veterans in the crowd. "Honor those who fell," he continued. "Support those who struggle. And remember that peace, however difficult to achieve, is always worth fighting for. The wars I fought in are over. The wars some of you fought in are over. But the work of preserving peace never ends. That is the duty we all share." The crowd rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Jake Morrison sat in the front row in his dress uniform. He saluted, and Henry returned the salute crisply. For just a moment, everyone could see past the elderly gardener to the warrior who had stood alone in darkness fighting a silent war so others could live in peace. After the ceremony, people gathered around Henry asking questions and sharing their own stories. He listened to each person with genuine interest. A young Marine who had just returned from deployment thanked him for paving the way. An older veteran from an earlier war clasped his hand and said he understood now why some things had to stay classified. Children approached with less fear than before. They asked if he had really been on another planet. Henry knelt down to their level and told them yes, he had been. He described Centauri Prime not as a battlefield, but as a world with 2 suns and purple skies. He told them about the importance of understanding others even when you disagree with them. One little girl asked if he had been scared. Henry smiled and said yes, he had been scared many times. But courage is not the absence of fear, he explained. It is doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid. The children listened with wide eyes, and Henry knew some of them would remember this conversation for the rest of their lives. As evening approached and the crowd thinned, Henry found himself standing with the other Ghost Protocol veterans. They had not seen each other in decades. Some had thought others were dead. They shared memories, carefully avoiding classified details but connecting over shared experiences that only they could understand. One of them, named Victor Lane, asked Henry why he had finally agreed to come forward. Henry thought about this for a moment. "I did not come forward," he said. "I was pulled forward by people who cared. But I am glad it happened. We spent too long in the shadows. It is good to stand in the light even if it feels uncomfortable." That evening, Henry returned to his house at the end of Maple Street. He sat on his porch as he had done thousands of times before. But tonight felt different. The weight of silence he had carried for 40 years felt lighter. Not gone, but easier to bear because it was shared now. Jake called from his base to check in. They talked about the ceremony and the other veterans who had attended. Jake mentioned that more Ghost Protocol operators were being identified and connected. A support network was forming for people who had spent decades thinking they were alone. Henry looked at his walls where new additions had appeared. A framed photograph from the ceremony showing him surrounded by veterans young and old. A letter from the Defense Council officially recognizing his service. Messages from people across Earth and even from some of the outer colonies thanking him for what he had done. But the thing he valued most was simpler. It was the knowledge that he could walk down Main Street, and people knew who he was and what he had done, and they still treated him like a neighbor. Not like a hero or a weapon or a ghost, just like Henry Collins, who grew good tomatoes and always returned baseballs that landed in his yard. Karen stopped by with fresh bread from her bakery. She sat with him on the porch and they watched the stars come out. She asked if he was happy with how everything had turned out. Henry considered the question seriously before answering. "I am content," he said. "I never wanted fame or recognition, but I am glad people know the truth now. Not for my sake, but for all the others who served in silence. They deserve to be remembered." The next morning, Henry woke at 5 as always. He did his exercises and made his coffee. He worked in his garden, pulling weeds and checking on the vegetables. Neighbors waved as they passed, and he waved back. Everything was the same as it had been for 15 years, yet somehow completely different. In the years that followed, Henry became a quiet advocate for veterans. He spoke at schools occasionally and helped other Ghost Protocol operators adjust to life after secrecy. He never sought attention, but he no longer avoided it either. He had found a balance between the silence he needed and the connection he deserved. Jake visited when he could, bringing news from the wider world. The Kraith peace had held and even strengthened. Some cultural exchanges had begun. There was talk of joint scientific missions. The war that had defined Henry's life was truly over, and the peace he had fought for was growing stronger. Henry Collins lived another 15 years in Riverside. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, the town mourned him as one of their own. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including Ghost Protocol veterans from across human space. The Kraith sent a delegation led by Commander Velk, who spoke about honor and respect between former enemies. They buried Henry in the town cemetery under a simple headstone that read Henry James, Collins and Master Sergeant and United States Marine Corps and 2042 to 2068. No mention of medals or code names, just the basic facts of a life well lived. But those who knew understood that beneath that simple stone lay a man who had changed history while asking for nothing in return. Jake Morrison stood at the grave after everyone else had left. He placed the Ghost Protocol pin on the headstone next to flowers others had brought. "You stood alone so we would not have to," he said quietly. "Rest easy, sir. We have the watch now." As Jake walked away, he looked up at the afternoon sky. Somewhere out there were worlds humanity had fought for and worlds they had yet to discover. The future Henry had helped secure was still being written. And in small towns across Earth and beyond, quiet veterans lived with their own stories of sacrifice and service. Some would be told and some would remain secret, but they all mattered, and Jake would make sure people remembered that. The end.